Oh, look at that. Look at that. That is what a well-sharpened plane looks like. Look at these. That is just amazing. Absolutely amazing. What the? Where did that come? Oh. Hello. So, as you can see, this plane needs a little bit of sharpening. So I'm going to let you in on my process of grinding, honing and polishing to get this thing back to a stupidly sharp edge. Now, what's more, despite the video length, this process should only take you about a minute or so. So it'll be a very good investment of your time to watch this thing the entire way through. Trust me. But a couple of things to note before we get stuck in. Firstly, the level of sharpness we're hoping to achieve here is going to be in the context of furniture making or any other task that requires a stupidly sharp blade, such as slicing fine meats and cheeses, I don't know. For that reason, it's probably going to be overkill for those of you just wanting to hog material off the side of a door or any other barbaric task that I've seen people do with these things. If you've already watched my chisel sharpening video, we're going to be repeating a few things in this one, so be sure to use the chapters in the video description to skip forward to the relevant section. So firstly, let's assess the damage, because you can be damn sure this chip does exist. And in fact, while I'm taking this apart, let's have a quick look at how it actually got there. Goes into the vise and alley-oop. Oh, I could stop right now, but I know this is going to be annoying so many people and it's making it so worth it. Yeah, I might have gone a bit over the top on that. Right, so there's a couple of things we need to do to this before progressing. The first one is going to be grinding back this bevel so it's nice and consistent all the way along. And the second one is going to be flattening the back to ensure that when we're sharpening it, we're actually hitting the area we need to be sharp, which is the tip. Because this thing is so damaged, what we're looking to do in these initial stages is get this back to a point or a condition that it was off the production line or purchased from a shop. One bevel, flat back. But even then, if you have just purchased this off the shelves, there's a few things you want to note in this process. So this is a side view of the plane blade we're going to be sharpening. As you can see, we've got one big bevel here, and then there's a very small one on the end as well. These two bevels are called the primary bevel, being this big one, and then we've got the secondary bevel. Now, as you've seen on my blade, the tip is very, very damaged. So let's replicate that real quick. So as you can see, it's absolutely knackered. Now, if we want to sharpen that, there's two things we can do. We could either regrind back the primary bevel, which would need to take off about that much material. And as you'd expect, that is going to take blimmin' ages to do. Or we can simply sharpen a little bit off the secondary bevel. So something like that. This is the advantage of using a secondary bevel when sharpening blades, because not only does it waste less material, it's also just a lot quicker. In terms of angles, the primary bevel is usually 25 degrees. This is how it comes off the production line in most cases. The secondary bevel is usually around about 30 degrees. Now keep in mind, these angles are guidelines. Not only does it not matter if your primary bevel is 24 degrees or 26 degrees, there's also cases in particular with planes where you may want to sharpen that secondary bevel to a steeper angle, something like 50 degrees instead of 30, or maybe even steeper if you're facing some real issues, but we'll cover that later. Because what we're focusing on now is the difference between a secondary bevel and a primary bevel. So you've already gone through it. Once that gets blunt, you then just sharpen a new secondary bevel, and then once that gets blunt, you sharpen a new secondary bevel, and then once that gets blunt, you sharpen a new secondary bevel. Obviously, you can see it gets to a point where that secondary bevel is larger than the primary. And it's in cases like this where you want to be regrinding that primary bevel back to 25 degrees, like that. Now, while that seems like a lot of material to remove, it's not actually that wasteful. You weren't using it for anything in the first place. As long as you stop grinding by the time the primary bevel reaches the tip, you'll be absolutely fine. If you're grinding all the way back here, then yes, you are wasting valuable material. But don't be put off by this. That material isn't going to be used, and you just then start again with your secondary bevels. Oh, that didn't work. Now, at the moment, the secondary bevel on this blade is quite small, and if the blade wasn't quite as damaged as this, I would just continue making that secondary bevel bigger. But because this blade is so damaged, by the time I sharpen out those chips, the secondary bevel is going to be massive, and I'll be needing to regrind it on the next session anyway. So I'm just going to get it out of the way now. I'm going to get it down to a fresh bevel. So then we'll have a nice blank slate and a solid foundation to build the subsequent sharpening processes on top of. So there's a couple of ways you can regrind this primary bevel. You can put it on a coarse stone, find the required angle, and then do figure of eights to grind it back to that 25 degrees. If you're not confident with freehand sharpening, you can get it set up in a honing guide at 25 degrees and grind like that. And I'll be showing you how to set up and use one of these honing guides in a couple of minutes. Or If you're lazy like me, you'll buy and use one of these things. This is called a Tormek. It's a powered grinder that allows you to remove material without the effort. An alternative might be something like this, which is a belt linisher. And of course, you've got things like high-speed bench grinders, among many other methods of sharpening. These are all methods of efficiently grinding back material without resorting to freehand sharpening or even grinding back with a honing guide. Because grinding back to a primary bevel using these methods can take a long time. It's not unachievable, but you'll be there a while. So if you're going to be sharpening often, it might be worth considering a powered option of some kind. Keep in mind with the Tormek, however, this is a water-cooled system, as opposed to something like this or a bench grinder, which are dry grinders. You've got to be careful with these dry grinders though, because if you heat up this steel too much, you're going to absolutely knacker it. It's not going to be able to hold its edge in the future. There are some steels, like high-speed steel, that can handle that heat, but not this stuff. If you are going to use a dry grinder, just make sure you periodically dip the blade in some sort of water to cool it down. Now, I'm not going to make this a sales pitch for a Tormek or anything, but if you are interested in any of the pieces of equipment I'm using here, I've got them all listed in the description below, as well as a few cheaper alternatives as well. What an awful sound. Ugh. All right, I'm not going to lie, there is some minor regret about how much I dented this blade. I'll see you on the other side. All right, so that's the primary bevel re-established. As you can see, there's fragments of material on the end that are just waiting to fall off. This is called a burr, and it's quite a common occurrence in sharpening. And me snapping it off like this isn't best practice. I'll show you how to properly do it later so that it doesn't dull the edge again. But yeah, we're in a pretty good place at the moment to start moving on to the next stage. So the next step in this process is going to be lapping, which for argument's sake means flattening. Flattening the back. This stage is very important because if the back is slightly rounded away, when it comes to flattening off the back of the blade, we're not actually hitting the tip, which is the part you need to be sharp. So making sure the scratches reach the tip is very important. So to flatten the back of a blade, if you're going to do this successfully, you need to make sure the stone you're flattening on is also flat. This is a Waterstone, which for argument's sake is pretty much the same as an Oilstone. You just put water on this instead of oil, and these will dip and dish over time. So I have got a flattening plate here that I flatten my Waterstone on, and it's so cold in here, ice has actually frozen on it. That is terrible. This is where you see the benefit of diamond stones come to life, because as long as you get a decent brand, those things will stay flat for life. So if you're interested in a slightly lower maintenance method of sharpening, I've put a few recommendations for all sorts of budgets in the description below. But for me, I prefer Waterstones because they just cut slightly quicker, and they do tend to clog slightly less than diamond stones in my experience as well, so I just prefer using these. Oh, that's cold. Now, when flattening the back, there's a couple of things to note here. When lowering the blade onto the stone, don't go in nose first like that and then lower it. Make sure to lower it on the blade first and then push it down. That way you're not going to damage the tip. Or even better, start it off the stone and then drag it on like that. The most important thing here though is just making sure it's flat. Don't go grabbing the blade here so it's accidentally tilting or whatever. And make sure there's nothing on the surrounding surface like this that you're resting on while flattening it. And if you want the most efficient way of flattening the back of a blade, if you can learn to do a figure-of-8 pattern like this, that is the most efficient way of removing material while also evenly wearing away the stone. And what we're looking for here is for the scratches to reach the very tip. Now at the moment they're a little bit scattered and randomized, so what I'll do is just hold it at an angle and go back and forth in straight motions and then check it, and that should be much easier to see where the scratches are going. So this is interesting. Can you see the scratches going off towards the camera? There's a nice even consistent shine going all the way to the tip, but then just around here it starts dipping off. The scratches aren't actually hitting the tip. This is why lapping the blade is so important, because it doesn't matter what fine grit you go to when sharpening the bevel. A sharp point is the intersection between two polished faces. You can polish one of them to an absolute mirror shine, but if the other one doesn't match it, there's going to be a trade-off on that point. And because the scratches weren't reaching the tip, that is the exact scenario I was likely to face. So I've got some flattening to do here. Now, if your blade is particularly rounded and you're really struggling to hit the tip, or you're just lazy in general, there is a little trick you can do here, which is often called the ruler trick. That's where you put a little 6-inch ruler on the side of the stone and you rest the blade on that ruler while flattening the back. This slightly elevates the blade so that you put all the focus on the very tip and therefore don't have to worry about flattening the rest of that face. All the cutting action is exactly where you need it. Now there's an important distinction to be made here, a very important distinction. You cannot do, or I shouldn't say you cannot do, but you should not by any means do the ruler trick on chisels. Chisels need to have a flat back in order to travel down perpendicular to whatever surface you're working on. If there is a back bevel on them, because that's what we're creating here, it's a bevel on the back of the blade. If there's a back bevel, when you hit that with a mallet, it's going to kind of bisect that angle and it's not going to travel down vertical. The backs of chisels need to be flat. Don't do the ruler trick on them. Plane blades are different. Plane blades are mounted at 45 degrees in relation to the sole of the plane. And because the bevel is on the bottom of the blade, at least in the case of standard bench planes, we will be talking about a slight difference later. But in this case, because the bevel's on the bottom, that means that the shaving is traveling up a 45-degree slope. If we put a little back bevel on the back of this blade, it effectively steepens that angle by point something of a degree. The shaving does not know that. It does not know the difference between 45 degrees and 45.02 degrees. It's just going to travel up that regardless, as long as this thing's sharp, of course. And so that is the reason why you can get away with using the ruler trick on a plane blade, but you absolutely cannot on a chisel. It will ruin it. Now for me, I prefer not to do the ruler trick. There's not really any reason why I don't like doing it, other than the fact I just like knowing that the back of this blade is flat. There's really no other reason for it. This water is so cold. This is really not the day to be getting cold water on my hands. It's a good job I've got this lovely hoodie to keep me warm, isn't it? Hint, hint. matteslea.com/shop. Oh. Link in the description. Oh man, sorry about that, sorry. All right, I believe we are there. If you can't quite tell, do some scratches one way, check it, and then do some scratches the other way with the blade hanging off the other side of the stone. You should be able to tell. Yeah, that's perfect. We are there. So next we want to go to the finer stone. This one is 6000, and we're going to start lapping the back of this blade to 6000 grit now. The previous one was 1000. This is where suction can be a real nightmare. And it's probably another case to be doing the ruler trick, because this is actually kind of hurting my hands now with how cold they are. Okay, so I'm now content that the back is all flat, and in fact, we have already got some level of sharpness with it. That is now taking off hairs, and we haven't even done any honing or polishing to the primary bevel yet, so we're at a good point now. So just to quickly summarize this segment on lapping, it's not necessarily about flattening the back of the entire blade. It's much more about making sure the area where the cutting edge is polished. And there's a couple of ways you can achieve that. You can either do it using the ruler trick. Some blade manufacturers will intentionally grind a hollow in the bottom of the blade, so when it comes to flattening the back of the blade, all the pressure is focused on the tip rather than distributed across the flat of the blade evenly, which is exactly what happened with the carpentry chisel I showed in my chisel sharpening video. We've got a polished bit here, we've got a little bit of polish here, but there's nothing happening here. The manufacturer has intentionally scooped this bit away so that when it's flattened, all the action happens here. What you absolutely do not want is a bump in the bottom of the blade. If that's the case, send it back to the manufacturer or whoever you bought it from. That blade is faulty and it is not your responsibility to try and flatten it, because you just can't. And so with this stage, a perfectly flat back is perfectly fine, a slightly hollowed back is perfectly fine, and in the case of plane blades, not chisels, just plane blades, a back bevel is also perfectly fine. But for both plane blades and chisels, what you absolutely don't want is a convex surface. If you do, send it back. Let's move on. So at the moment we are here. We have got a 25-degree primary bevel and we've got a perfectly flat back. However, if you want a slightly more accurate representation, we've actually got a slight radius on this thing because of the round wheel on the Tormek. Now, I said this in the chisel sharpening video and I'll say it again. There are people out there who will tell you that a hollow grind is wrong, it is bad and you shouldn't do it. They never have an argument as soon as you question them about that logic. I've got a machine that does a hollow grind and I've got a Linisher that does a flat grind. There is no difference between the two. Not to mention the fact that when we put a secondary bevel on this, damn it, oh come on, when we put a secondary bevel on this, that is going to be flat anyway. So you can ignore those people. Let's move on to honing now. So to put this secondary bevel on, we're going to be using a honing guide with the blade mounted at 30 degrees. I've got a protrusion stop to allow me to get it set up to bang on 30 degrees. And then we've got this lovely little screwdriver to lock it down. People ask me about this screwdriver all the time. Yes, it is awesome. Yes, I would recommend it. And yes, I've listed it in the description below. Now, just to talk a little bit about honing guides themselves, the reason I use one of these is for repeatability. What I haven't really said about this is it doesn't matter if that secondary bevel ends up being 29 degrees or 31 degrees or 30.275. What does matter, however, is that every time you set it up, you want it to be the exact same angle as it was last time. That's how you make this process quick and efficient. If every time you set it up, it's a different angle to what it was before, you're going to have bevels all over the place and it's going to take a lot longer than it should do. Honing guides give you that consistency, especially when used in combination with a protrusion stop like this. I'll put a link to a video below showing you how to make one of these. Now, similar to lapping, when you lower the blade onto this, make sure you go wheel and then blade. Don't go blade and then wheel. Otherwise, it's no wonder you're struggling to get the thing sharp. So wheel, blade, and then we're just going to do a couple of drags back with even pressure. I'm using my 1000 grit stone for this, and 3 or 4 should be all we need to get a decent secondary bevel started. Next, we're going to flip the stone over to the 6000 grit side, and we're going to start producing a camber on this blade. This is where the methods of sharpening a chisel versus sharpening a plane really begin to diverge. A camber is a very, very subtle curve in the end of the blade that has numerous benefits over having a plain straight edge. And I'll show you these benefits later, providing you stick around. To produce this camber, we're going to pick 5 points on the end of the blade. We've got the 2 outermost points, we've got 2 intermediate points, and then we've got 1 in the middle. For the 2 outermost points, we're going to do 10 strokes back and forth on these. We're then going to do 5 on the intermediate ones, and then we're going to do, I don't know, 3, 4 in the middle. So when you're doing this, put all the pressure in that area, but don't let the blade tilt. You want to make sure it's flat, but there's more pressure here than there is here. And because this stone is nice and light, you'll be able to see the tracks being created very easily. So all the pressure there, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The other outermost point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Intermediate points, go right there, and we'll do 5. 5 here. And then we'll do a couple in the middle. And so if we now flip this over, what that's done is created a secondary bevel that is larger on the outsides than it is in the middle, thus putting a curve in the blade, a very, very subtle one at that. What we've also done in sharpening this secondary bevel is created another burr on the flat of the blade, which now needs to be removed. And so I've just flattened the stone, and the advantage here is because we've already lapped to the back of the blade and we know it's flat and all that, this won't take much work at all. Just a few strokes like that, maybe a little figure of 8. I mean, it's all suctioning down, but we'll get it to work. Just a little something like that. And that should be all we need for this, because we know from the lapping process that this is hitting the tip of the blade. And so that already is pretty damn sharp. This is some very thick cardboard I've got here, but we're going to take this a step further. The process we've just completed is honing, and for me, I kind of class honing as anything up to about 6,000 grit. If you go beyond 6,000 grit to say 8,000, 10,000, 15,000, or even 30,000, that's kind of where it starts getting in the realm of polishing. And polishing is still a form of sharpening and all that. It's just that certain thresholds tend to be given different names. For example, anything up to about 400 grit is grinding, anything from 400 grit to about 6,000 grit is honing, and then anything 6,000 grit and above is polishing. Those are the boundaries that I kind of describe things by, but those boundaries may be variable depending on who you ask. There's no kind of set rule for it. And for this, we're going to be using a leather strop. Now, a leather strop has 2 functions. The first one is that it removes any remnants of the burr that have folded themselves back over to the bevel side, because just to go through the process again, we sharpen the bevel, which then folded a burr to the flat, and then we flatten the back to remove that burr, but inevitably some of that burr will have folded back around to the other side. If you just try and break it off, it's going to end up blunting the edge. It's best to remove it gently using something like this. In fact, I've got a funny story about this. I was once doing a demonstration, and because I'm kind of young, there was someone old in the crowd who was kind of smug and looking down on me. And he kind of turned his nose up at the fact I was using a leather, and he said, oh, back in the day, we used to just use our hands for this. Which is, you know, fine. Leather is skin and skin is skin, so you can technically do that. But I don't think he quite comprehended how sharp I had already got that chisel off the 6,000 grit. So he got the chisel, it wasn't a plain blade, it was a chisel, and he started stropping it on his hand using this method that he used to do, and he sliced the side of his hand open. Idiot. I mean, of course, I was so sympathetic and so compassionate about his injury. Instant karma. I loved it. It was so funny. Anyway, leather strop. It's usually best to put a little bit of oil on this. This is 3-in-1, but you can use any sort of oil. Camellia oil, jojoba oil, whatever. Olive oil if you want to make it smell like chips. And then we're going to put a little bit of this polishing paste on it as well. This is the equivalent of about 15,000 grit, according to my calculations. So then I'm going to lower the blade onto it and lift it up until we see the shadow on the end disappear. So right about there, lock our arms into that position and drag it back. We don't want to put too much pressure on this because there is flex in leather. And if you push it down, it's going to curve around the edge. Very very gentle pressure, just drag it back. And if you've got the angle too low, you'll feel it kind of scraping on the strop. And if you've got it too high, you'll feel it scraping on the strop. When you've got it perfectly on that bevel, it should feel nice and smooth. Then once you've done that, you want to flip it over and do it on the flat. Again, very light pressure with this because we don't want to be rounding the back at all. One stroke on that, back to the bevel, and I tend to just flip between them a couple of times just to really polish that edge. And so now that is very, very sharp. Right, so I've now got the blade set up in the plane because I want to talk a little bit about the function of the camber in this, because the benefits are twofold. The first one is that if we're planing a flat surface like this, the corners of the blade are now out of the cut, so we're not going to be left with any tracks. You can actually see on the shavings how it tapers off at the edges. So it's really nice for that reason, and you haven't got to worry about feeling any lumps and bumps in it because that curve is so shallow. Not a chance you'll be able to feel it. The second one is if you're wanting to square up an edge, let's say this side is higher than this side, you can centralize the plane over that and it's only going to take a shaving from that side of the material, which is beneficial because with a flat blade, you'd either have to try and tilt the plane or you'd have to mess around with the lateral adjuster on the back of the blade to skew it. With a camber, it's set up the exact same every single time and you can just move it to the left or right depending on where you want to take material from. And by the way, if you want to learn how to make shavings like this from a plane, there's a link to a video in the description below. So I put a camber on all of my bench planes, whether it's a number 4 smoother like this, or if it's a low angle jack plane with the bevel up, or if it's a block plane like this. All of these have cambers on for the exact reason I just showed you. Things like shooting planes, shoulder planes, and router planes, however, do not. These are just flat grinds on them because at least with these two, I need the corners of those blades to get into rebates or grooves or whatever. Rounding those off would be detrimental to the performance of these. As for a shooting plane, there's just absolutely no need to put a camber on it whatsoever. Straight grind is absolutely fine. Now, in terms of maintaining this blade, there is an important thing to note. Obviously, when we sharpened the camber, we did 10 strokes on the outermost points, 5 in the intermediate, and then a couple in the middle. Now, if you keep doing that every single time you sharpen the blade, it's then going to be 20 points on the outside, it's going to be 10 there, and then it's going to be like, I don't know, 6 or 8 in the middle or so. And then you do it again. It'll be 30, then 15, and then however much it would be. And what you'll probably notice here is that camber just becomes exponentially bigger. So that means when it comes to maintaining the camber, what you want to do is do the same number of strokes in all 5 positions. Because bear in mind with these, in order to lift the corners out the cut, you only need this blade to curve back as much as the thickness of one of these shavings, which is nothing. It's so inconceivably small that making that camber bigger than it needs to be is a waste of metal and time. So in the interest of showing you this and also demonstrating how quick it is to actually sharpen a blade, let's do it now. So honing guide goes on, this goes up to 30 degrees, lock it down, this goes on. Bear in mind I'm doing this with freezing cold hands. Then we'll do 10 strokes here, 10 in the next position, 10 again, 10 again, and then 10 right against here. I think I lost count on that one. This comes out, flattening the back to remove that burr. Again, don't need to do much flattening because the back is lapped. Take that out, remove the burr that's folded back over, flatten off the back very lightly and just flip between the two, and that should be lovely and sharp. Sweet. And we've done that all while maintaining the radius of that camber. And so that's it. That's how you sharpen a plane blade. And so the next logical step is to learn how to set this up in a plane to produce shavings like this, which you can do so by clicking the video below. But before you do that, be sure to press the like button, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.